on this computer. Okay, well, welcome everybody. So last week we were starting to talk about the Gospel of Mark, and I'm going to try to share my screen if I can find the right one. And I admit I'm a little behind this week.
Well, you were running today.
Yes.
Sure.
So I think I'm ready to go, but not as polished as it might have been otherwise.
Yeah, don't worry about it.
Okay. All right, so we've been looking at, now why do I have two screens on here? That's weird. Okay. I've been using as a resource the Fortress Introduction to the Gospels, written by a former seminary professor of mine. And come on, computer. Next slide. There we go. All right. So this was a graphic I shared last week that goes with the two source theory or the four source theory. And just to summarize again, this is looking at what was the order that the Gospels were written in, and how might each Gospel have been used by the other Gospels, because there's enough content that is very similar between some of the Gospels that we think they must have informed each other somehow. So we had talked about like the way the Gospels were composed, that likely they had some written sources of stories, they had some oral tradition that had been shared in communities, and the different writers of the different Gospels put those together, organize that material in a way that suited their purpose, which was to share the gospel in different ways. So the theory is the two source, also called the four source theory, just to be confusing. The theory is that the first of the four Gospels to be written was the Gospel of Mark, and that Luke and Matthew both had a copy of Mark's Gospel that they used when they were writing their Gospels, because so much of what's found in Mark is also found in Luke and Matthew. And then Luke and Matthew also each had their own material that was theirs alone that they saw when they were putting these together. And so those are kind of known as the extra sources, like the Luke source, unique to Luke and unique to Matthew. And then there is another set of material that is found in both Luke and Matthew, but not in Mark. So that is the double tradition that's down here. And those are so similar that scholars suppose that there was another written document that they both had that they refer to as Q, which is short for the German word for source. Very original name, just call it source. And that material tends to be things that Jesus said. So they think there was some extra book of sayings that they used. So looking at this chart, we have the Gospel of Mark is at the top, and the things that are common to both Matthew and Mark are 18% of Mark and 10% of Matthew. Matthew is the other gospel that brought more of Mark into it. So a lot of Mark, or most of Mark, is found also in Matthew. But importantly, sometimes it was changed slightly or rearranged or shortened or expanded. And so scholars are looking at that to say, so by making a change, and we can tell it was a change because we can look at Mark and see how it's different from Matthew, we can surmise that Matthew had a goal that was better served by the change than keeping it the same. And in some cases, it was just brought over altogether the way it was written in Mark. All right, so and it's kind of a confusing looking chart, but I hope that that kind of makes sense, what we're talking about. So then we were talking about, now I gotta move this over.
Oh.
We were talking about Mark's gospel. Who wrote Mark's gospel and when and for whom? I just hid your pictures so that I could see my screen if you need to interrupt me, please say so. Don't wave your arms because I won't see your face. So who wrote Mark's gospel? And all of these are things that we as modern people have tried to figure out using the texts. So, we don't have any other eyewitness accounts of who wrote Mark's gospel. We don't have any biographies about the author. So we try to piece together who wrote it and when it was written and for whom it was written by looking at the gospel itself and just kind of drawing conclusions from there. So it's sort of like reverse treasure hunting, I guess. We're looking at what Mark said, and then because of how it's said and what he says and what he doesn't say, we can have some pretty good conclusions about who wrote it and when and who he wrote it for. So the very early traditions in the church say like 300 years after Jesus, 400 years, they started to ascribe Mark's gospel, say that it was written by the character that's found in the book of Acts, whose name's John Mark. But there's not that was like also something that maybe the church in the 4th century, 3rd century was trying to do to kind of add credibility to these gospels by saying, oh, well, it's so authentic, it was written by John Mark himself, so other than the fact that it was suggested very early on, there's not a lot of other evidence to suggest that was true. So most scholars don't try to figure out who the author was. We just kind of assume it was probably somebody named Mark. Mark was a pretty common name. And scholars don't really worry a whole lot about Mark being another identified character in the Bible. Most scholars agree that this gospel was written around the time of the Jewish war with Rome. And that war happened in between 66 and 70, the years 66 and 70. So in the 1st century. And we know that the temple was destroyed in the year 70. And there's some reference in this gospel to the desolation of the temple. There's a reference to that's mentioned at one time, the desolation, or I can't remember exactly how it's phrased. But it was the case that the attacking Roman army kind of profaned the temple. I think if I remember right, I didn't just read this, so my memory is not great. I feel like they set up a statue of the emperor or something in the temple, maybe, or they destroyed things. I can't remember what they did, but there was something before the temple was destroyed that was kind of what's the word? Profane. It affected the perceived holiness of the temple because of how the Romans treated it as part of the war. And so that is what scholars think the Gospel of Mark is referring to when it says something about the desolation in the temple. So they think that must have happened already by the time Mark wrote it down. So that's how the date reference comes into play. So I think it was written probably a few years after this happened, if that makes sense. And just trying to read the clues, what is important, or why would Mark the author have written this gospel. Because this is the earliest one, we think, and just because of how it was written, we think it was, the purpose was to try to preserve the tradition as faithfully as possible, because the disciples, the first generation, were starting to pass away. We didn't want to lose those stories and lose the firsthand accounts. And the way Mark wrote the gospel, it was clear that the author expected Jesus to return at any moment. There's kind of an urgency to it. So you tell him, puppy. All right. So I presented this last week, but I just want to, I think I went through it pretty quickly. So what is unique about Mark? What is different about Mark compared to the other three gospels? So the first thing that you'll notice, or that's unique about Mark, is there aren't any birth stories about Jesus. There's no shepherds, magi, Mary, Joseph. It just starts with Jesus as an adult. And actually the very beginning of the book starts with John the Baptist preaching and teaching and proclaiming in the wilderness that someone is coming after him. And then the next scene is John baptizing Jesus. So we don't get any backstory on Jesus at all, or set up for him being a holy person from birth. We just have him as an adult. So that's partly why Mark is the shortest gospel, because there's no birth stories.
Yeah.
That's unique about Mark. And do you all have a Bible with you or near you that you
Yes.
could look up
Yes.
Mark?
Sure.
So if you would turn to the end of Mark
Oh, yeah.
in your Bible, and just tell me what number is the last verse, or what do you see at the very end of the book of Mark in your Bible?
In addition. Longer ending of Mark, it says.
Yes. So mine too has something that says the longer ending of Mark, and it starts with verse 9 and goes all the way to verse 20.
Yeah.
Do other people have that? Something that says the longer or the shorter ending of Mark?
Yes.
Okay.
Mine ends at 16.
Okay. And is there anything, yours ends at 16, in Mark? A verse, chapter or verse 16?
Chapter.
Chapter
Chapter
16. Yeah,
16.
what's the last number, the verse number that you have?
20.
20. Okay. So depending on your Bible and how the editors put it together, usually the Bible makers will kind of set apart verses 9 through 20. And in mine it says the longer ending of Mark. There's also another single verse that's called the shorter ending of Mark. But when I look at the my footnotes, and I have a study Bible, HarperCollins Study Bible, NRSV. For the shorter ending of Mark, it says this was added not earlier than the 4th century CE. And then in the footnote for the longer ending of Mark, it says, although known as early as the late 2nd century CE, the longer ending is missing from the earliest, most reliable Greek manuscripts and seems to mix motifs and phrases from the other Gospels. So what does that mean?
Somebody else wrote it?
Yeah, so it probably was not written by the person who wrote the rest of the Gospel of Mark. So it could be that somebody didn't like how Mark ended and fixed it by kind of telling the rest of the story as they know it from the other Gospels. It could be that the oldest manuscripts are missing this part and it really was there originally, although most scholars don't believe that. So most scholars think that this gospel actually ends with verse 8. So they went out, that is the women who came.
Yeah,
So
the-
they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. I love that as an ending for this gospel. I can see why there may have been early Christians who were like, we can't leave it with that as the ending. That sounds like things were bad at the end, and there's no resurrection story here. So, I mean, there is a resurrection story because the person at the tomb said he is
Oh, yeah.
risen. But we don't have any account of that, like what they saw, or they didn't speak to Jesus in this original gospel. So I always like Mark's ending. I just think that's a cool way to end, that the women were terrified and didn't say anything to anyone, because clearly somebody must have said something to someone, or else we wouldn't know about it.
Yeah.
Well, I just like the fact that they were women.
Yeah.
I mean, that's unusual to put that down.
Well, and the fact that every gospel has women at the tomb witnessing the empty tomb suggests that that has to be a historically accurate piece of the story. Even though the different accounts are slightly different of who, like which woman was there and what happened, exactly what they saw, it must be the case that it was women that first witnessed the empty tomb, because women were not very reliable witnesses in Jesus' time, not because they weren't reliable, but because they just were not taken seriously. And so the fact that these accounts name them as the first witnesses means it must have been so well established, and everybody knew that was the case, that they couldn't hide it or make it sound more official by having, reporting that men were there instead.
Was it, do you think, excuse me, it almost seems though as if it was the custom, according to 16:1, it was the custom of the women to bring spices that they might go and anoint him.
Right?
Like, wouldn't women typically do that at that time?
Yes, that would have been a woman's job to do that anointing. Yes.
Okay.
But as when we compare this story to the story in other gospels, like Peter is there. And
Okay.
Peter and another disciple are there. There's a couple men there too,
Okay.
because yeah, well, we'll talk about why. I mean, maybe they really were there too, but there's no men in this story. Instead, the young man in the tomb tells them to go and tell the disciples and Peter that that Jesus is going ahead of them to Galilee.
Mm-hmm.
So this may make more sense what I'm saying when we compare it to the other gospels later on. All right, so what else is unique about Mark?
Because immediately.
So this is the thing that always comes to my mind about Mark, that in Mark's gospel, things are told quickly and efficiently, and the word immediately appears 42 times in this gospel. Something happens and immediately something else happens. So if we look in the first chapter of Mark, which I'm flipping to also. All right, starting at verse 9 in chapter 1. This is where Jesus enters the story. The first part is about John the Baptist. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And just as he was coming up out of the water, so that sort of sounds like an immediate thing too. Just as he was coming up, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove, and a voice from heaven, "You are my Son, the beloved, with you I'm well pleased." And the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. All right, and I'm trying to figure out the next immediately. Skip ahead to verse 18, 17 and 18. Jesus said to Simon and Andrew, "Follow me and I will make you fish for people." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. And then he saw James and John, and immediately he called them and they left. So if you were to look at what happens in the first chapter of Mark's gospel, we have John the Baptist, baptism of Jesus, temptation of Jesus. Jesus goes into Galilee, calls the disciples. He heals a man with an unclean spirit. He heals a bunch of people at Simon's house. He goes on a tour in Galilee. He cleanses a leper. All of those things are told really efficiently and quickly in Mark's gospel. So this is one reason that scholars think that Mark's gospel was written first, because take the temptation story. If you were remembering the temptation story, the temptation of Jesus, you probably would remember more than what is told here in Mark's gospel. You probably remember the devil tempting Jesus, telling him, leap down from this high point. And Jesus replies, "You will not put the Lord to the test." There's dialogue between Jesus and the devil, by Satan. Well, those are other gospels. They expanded or told more of the story, and Mark is generally a pretty efficient storyteller, and the action happens quickly. So if I were to test you and to give you a passage that had the word immediately in it, that would be your cue. Oh yeah, that's probably Mark. All right, so Mark emphasizes Jesus' deeds over his words. And part of that is just comparing it, or most of that's comparing it to Luke and Matthew, because Luke and Matthew have long passages of Jesus teaching, like the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain, where Jesus says the Beatitudes that will come up in this Sunday's gospel reading. That's not found in Mark's gospel. There's not a lot of long passages of Jesus teaching. It tends to be focused more on what he's doing. So the beginning of Mark's gospel, Jesus is doing a lot of healing, a lot of and miracles, a few miracles, and a little bit of teaching. And then the last part is all about the passion story, or Jesus heading to the cross. So the passion, if that's not a word that you're familiar with in this context, it comes from the word for suffering. Passion means the suffering with. So it's the passion narrative is the story of Jesus being arrested and charged and crucified. The movie, The Passion of the Christ, is probably the most familiar use. Many people have heard that word used. But that's what we use to describe the kind of the end of the story. And the passion part of Mark's gospel takes up more of the gospel comparatively than it takes up in the other gospels, if that makes sense. Because once you take out a lot of teaching part, or you don't include all the teaching parts that Matthew and Luke use, there's a shorter amount of story to tell, I guess. So the passion actually starts in Mark's gospel with, usually we think of Mark 11, probably the Jesus entering Jerusalem on the donkey. Is it on a donkey here? On a colt. And so from Mark 11 to the end of 16, all of that is about the passion of Jesus, or that's kind of the section that we think of as the passion. I guess he gets more into the talking. Yeah, there's still some stuff in here too, but it's not all about that. But that's kind of the pivot point. All right. Most of the action focuses on the region of Galilee in this gospel. Jesus is not wandering far beyond Galilee, which is a slight difference from some of the other gospels. And this is the other big thing that I think is a key that's unique to Mark, is it's kind of referred to as the messianic secret. And that is so often when Jesus is interacting with people in Mark's gospel, he'll say, don't tell anybody. Like if they say that, oh, you really are the Son of God, he'll say, don't tell anybody, keep it a secret, or don't let it be known. And I should have a reference handy for you to see that, and I don't have one. Let me see if I can find one real quick.
It's probably one after the leper.
Yeah, there's probably a couple lepers. Are you looking at the leper story at the beginning? Let's see. Yes, you're right. So chapter 1, Jesus heals a leper, cleanses his skin. And then in verse 43, he says, after sternly warning him, he sent him away at once, saying to him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded. So this happens often enough that it's peculiar in Mark's gospel that he says, don't say anything to anyone. And so scholars try to figure out, well, why is that? Why would they say that? And one of the things they suppose, one of the possible reasons why Jesus would keep it a secret, is that in Mark's gospel, Jesus doesn't want to be known as a miracle worker. So that's not why he came, to do miracles. But yet, if everybody starts spreading the word about that, then that's all he's going to be known for. And that wasn't his point, or that wasn't his whole deal, to be a doer of miracles. So that's one reason that they suggest for the secret. I think there's another reason too, and I don't remember what it is, but it's probably not that interesting to you.
Like the bread king,
What's that?
like the bread king. You
The
follow
bread-
him, you'll be fed. Like when he broke up the bread and fed the 5,000 or 3,000.
Right. And they were following him and wanting him to give more bread. Yes. And he doesn't want that to be his shtick.
Yeah.
So I think this is the last thing I've said about what's unique about Mark, is that this gospel kind of highlights Jesus' failures, or not Jesus' failures, the disciples' failures. That, like, the further we go in the gospel, the less the disciples seem to get it. So that by the very end of the gospel, the women leave, they flee in terror, and they don't say anything to anyone. And that may be that the writer is trying to invite the reader in to see themselves in this gospel, that we don't have to have it all figured out, that Jesus still calls people to follow him who don't have who have doubts and who wonder sometimes what's going on. So there's a reference to Jesus saying, that the disciples have no faith. Why have you no faith? Why are you faithless? And when we compare that to Matthew says, oh, you of little faith. At least in Matthew, they have a little faith. in Mark's gospel, they have no faith at all. Oh,
I have a
good.
question.
Yeah,
Why the repetition of the Son of Man? It's always the Son of Man.
yeah, that's one of the titles of Jesus in here, the Son of Man. Let me do some work on that and see if I can come up with a good explanation. I don't think I have
Okay.
them at the ready. So finally, I think this is finally, there are women in Mark's gospel who appear in different stories who help the reader to discover some new thing, or even help Jesus to see a new insight. So one of them is I think it's the Syrophoenician woman, who wants Jesus to heal her daughter. And the woman doesn't have a name, or she's not given a name in the Bible. I'm trying to find it. Here it is. Mark 7. Her daughter has an unclean spirit, and so it's chapter 7, starting at verse 24. And so she begs him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And Jesus says, "Let the children be fed first. It's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So if you've never heard that story before, this may not make sense, but if that's familiar to you, basically she says, yeah, but my daughter deserves healing too. That it's not just the children of Israel that need to be healed and saved. And Jesus' mind is kind of opened at that exchange. So the woman's role in the story is to bring about some new insight in seeing that. And this happens more than once in this gospel. And now I can't remember another time that it happens, but it happens like 3 or 4 times according to Mark Powell, that it's women that don't. I think one is a woman that the sinful woman. It's in the Passion story that comes when he's at dinner. The anointing. The woman, it's not a sinful woman. See, all these different stories get mixed up in my head too. It's hard to keep them straight. It's in Mark 14. He's at the home of Simon the leper, as it's described, and the woman breaks open an alabaster jar of costly ointment, and so she in that story also plays kind of a role of bringing some new insight. Okay, so if I were doing a test, or if I were studying this in seminary, I would pay attention to the birth story thing, how it starts, how the messianic secret is a recurring theme, and the word immediately. That's what I would test on if I were being tested on that. Those are kind of unique things to Mark. All right, I want to show you something. That was not it. Let me stop share for a second. I'm going to show you a different screen. So I mentioned last week this book I have that's the synopsis of the Gospels. Looks like this. And I printed a couple pages so that I can show you what it looks like. So this is a way that scholars are comparing the different Gospels. So I gotta share this screen. That's the Greek version, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, can you see this?
Yep,
All right, this should all look Greek to you.
it does.
It does.
All right. If I switch to another PDF, let me see if you can see that. Do you see a different one in English now, or do you still, are you still looking at, you
Yeah.
see that one?
Yeah.
Okay, so you see English.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so this is what this book does. It lines up the passages that are similar to each other in when they exist in all four gospels to kind of show, so you can compare what the differences are. So in this case, it's showing just the first verse or the first few verses of each gospel. So the first column is Matthew, then Mark, then Luke, then John. So the very beginning of Mark's gospel is just these words, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So Mark is very clear. This is a gospel I'm writing. This is the good news of Jesus. Matthew's gospel starts the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then Matthew's gospel lists who begat who it's a list of names of, Abraham was the father of. So that's how Matthew's gospel starts. Luke's gospel starts with a little longer prologue or a little introduction. And we'll get to that when we get to Luke. And then the Gospel of John, this should sound familiar because we often read it at Christmas time. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now I want to show you what it looks like in Greek.
Ugh.
No.
Okay, if you say so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me see if I can move this. Okay. So if you look over here, can you see what I'm moving? The little, can you see my cursor moving? I don't know what you can
Yes.
see. Okay. So I'm over John. I'm looking at John. So I did take Greek in seminary. I'm not an expert of reading Greek, but the Greek text that we have originally didn't have any punctuation, didn't have any accent marks, I don't think. No, maybe they did. Didn't have any capital or lowercase letters. So everything that we know is like chapter numbers or verse numbers or even sentences, I think, has been surmised by editors later on who looked at the original Greek text and figured it out, that this is what it says. So the very beginning here, I'm just going to read a little bit of verse 1. En arche ne ho logos. That means in, arche is the beginning, in beginning. En ho logos. Logos is the word. In beginning was the word. Kai means and ho logos, and the word was proston theon. Theos is God. So it says, and the word was of God or from God. And Kai, Theos, God, and God was ho logos, the word. So it says, in beginning was the word, and the word was from God, and God was the word.
Mm.
So back here, in the beginning was the word, and the word was with God, and the word was God. So it's not an exact translation of each word from the Greek into the English, because what I read probably sounded a little funny because it's just not the way we construct English sentences. But that's how we translate it into how we understand what it's saying. And then I'm just going to end with this at the bottom here. So see all these little marks?
Mm-hmm.
We talked a couple of weeks ago about text studies and looking at old manuscripts and when does one manuscript read differently than another manuscript.
Mhm.
So we're talking about like the very oldest copies of this Greek text. And sometimes there will be a copy or one that's like got a little slightly different version. And so that's what all these little notes are down here, is variations found in different texts. So I'm going to go back over to the Greek and you're never going to do this because I never do this anymore either, but all of these are footnotes that say, all right, this appears slightly different in this text, the one that's found in Alexandria or whatever. Each of these little symbols represents a different manuscript. I used to know how to do this because I needed to know how to do it for a class, but I have never gotten into the study of texts in a way that I would use this on a regular basis. But if I wanted to, I have a book that lists all this information and kind of compares it. So I don't know. I another time next week I'll share kind of a side-by-side comparison from this book that shows how Mark told the story and then how Luke or Matthew slightly changed it when they told it in their gospels. All right, we're at our time. What questions or comments do you want to make?
I have a question,
Yeah.
and it's from the first verse of Mark, and I obviously don't know whether or not this is typical of the Gospels, but it says, in the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. What does he mean by as it is written in Isaiah the prophet? Is it verified by comparing Isaiah and Mark? I mean,
Yeah.
is that
So
what the reference is for? So that there can be an emphasis on Isaiah said this a long time ago, and now look, here we are, it's happening.
yep, that's it. So John the Baptist is trying to demonstrate that Jesus is the one that we've been hearing about in our scriptures. Jesus is the one Isaiah was talking about. Actually, in here, it's not Jesus' words, or it's not John's words. It's Mark's words about John. So Mark is saying John is the one that Isaiah was talking about, who had appeared in the wilderness. So it's lending credence to the story Mark is telling by saying it's the fulfillment of what we have in our scriptures.
Okay.
Yeah. So my study Bible will actually refer to what verses of Isaiah you can find that in. If I can find it, verse 2. The quotation, it says in my Bible, the quotation conflates material from Isaiah 40, verse 3 with Exodus 23, verse 20, and Malachi 3, verse 1. So it's not a direct quote from one place, but it would be familiar words to Mark's audience.
Okay.
All right. Well, so we got through Mark and what's different about Mark. Next time we'll finally get to Matthew and talk a little bit more about Matthew's gospel, and then we'll do Luke, Acts, and John. Oh, we got a lot to do still. We'll get through them. We'll get through them.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you for joining me today. If you have questions that come up or things that you thought about you didn't get to ask me, send me a note or bring it up next week. All right.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.